Welcome, everyone. It's my honor to welcome you to the 110th Distinguished Research Lecture. The Distinguished Research Lectureship is among the highest honors that faculty at CU Boulder grant upon fellow faculty members and is sponsored by the Research and Innovation Office. The Research and Innovation Office is sponsoring 2 Distinguished Research Lectures during the 2016-17 school year. Today, Dr. Thomas T. Veblen from the College of Arts and Sciences rightfully joins this long list of influential scholars as the 110th lecturer and will deliver a distinguished research lecture titled Wildfire Regime Shifts in Patagonian-Andean Forest Ecosystems, Feedbacks and Consequences in the Face of Climate and Land Use Changes. Terry Fees, Vice Chancellor for Research, will tell you a little bit more about this.
Thomas T. Veblen is a College of Arts and Sciences Geography Professor of Distinction. Today, he will present a lecture exploring over 40 years of field-based research on the dynamics of Patagonian-Andean forests in Chile and Argentina. After receiving his PhD degree, Tom took the unusual route of turning down a tenure-track position at University of Texas to join the Peace Corps and was stationed at forestry school in Chile from 1975 to 1979. Some would say he was crazy. He followed this with 2 years as a research fellow at the Forest Research Institute in New Zealand. In 1981, he joined the University of Colorado Boulder and has graduated 32 PhDs during his tenure here. Throughout his career, he has continued to foster relationships in Chile and New Zealand, leading to several of his former PhD students now holding significant academic leadership positions in those countries. His research focuses on disturbance ecology in the context of climate change and human impacts on temperate forest ecosystems in North America and South America. In the U.S. Rocky Mountains, his research uses tree ring reconstructions to examine the long-term history of wildfire and bark beetle outbreaks in the context of changing climate. He was awarded a John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Fellowship in 1985, elected an honorary fellow of the Royal Society of New Zealand in 1981, and named a fellow of the American Association for Advancement of Science in 2008. He has been long engaged in extensive public outreach efforts to promote science-based decision-making in forest management policy and adaptation to climate change. When I meet with faculty in preparation for these presentations, I like to ask them about their hobbies. Being in Boulder, the answer is often the same: hiking, biking, outdoors, the usual Boulder things. Tom surprised me with his interesting hobby. He took up the Argentine tango in 1994 and has been a vital part of the vibrant Boulder tango community. Who knew? We did want a demo afterwards, but he basically said he won't do it. So it's our pleasure today to hear about Dr. Veblen's research, which will be immediately followed by a reception here in the ballroom over on the side. Please join me in congratulating Dr. Thomas Veblen as the 2016 Distinguished Research Lecturer.
Well, thank you, Russ and Terry, for the introduction. And thank you for coming. It's nice to see some familiar faces, some from long ago, graduates from our geography department from several decades ago, actually. Nice to see a few faces from the tango community here as well. So, before I get into the heart of the topic, I want to sort of set the context. These are unsettling times for people that work broadly in the field of environmental science. Very unsettling for people who work on climate change and people like myself who work on climate change impacts. It's reasonable for us to be alarmed by these sorts of headlines and news reports. They're very concerning. I think it's just great that the selection committee decided to recognize work in the environmental sciences related to climate change impact in that context. So I certainly thank the committee for that decision. In preparing for this, I was thinking about, okay, it's going to be a general audience. It's a chance to reach out to the public, so maybe I could find some guidance from some other people who do this on a regular basis. This is an editorial recently published by Jane Lubchenco, who is a marine biologist. She's been very influential in a sort of campaign called the social contract, meaning basically that scientists, researchers have a social contract to devote their best efforts, talents, time, energy, and so on to working on pressing scientific problems of societal significance. She also is the recent director of NOAA, which is one of the agencies which is perhaps slated for crippling budget cuts. The quote from the bottom also sums up a number of conversations that I've had with senior, let's say old, researchers. It says, after 2 weeks of clinical depression following the election, I realized the work we are doing has never been more important. And I think after the initial shock, that is a very common sentiment among a lot of the more senior folks who work in environmental science. So I'm going to use a couple of points as guides from Jane Lubchenco's editorial in terms of standing up for science by demonstrating its value and our relevance, provide hope and optimism by highlighting the profusion of existing successes. It's much too easy to just fall into a habit of doom and gloom. I'll try and avoid that. So as Vice Chancellor Fies pointed out, in 1975, instead of starting an academic career in the US, I decided to take an adventure, take a risk perhaps, and I went to southern Chile as a volunteer in the Smithsonian Peace Corps Environmental Program. I remember getting the job description, which I will read to you, and believe me, I still have the job description, so I don't throw away things. So, much of the native forest in the southern region of Chile is dominated by several species of Nothofagus. While there has been considerable exploitation of these forests, quite a lot remains in undisturbed condition. What is desired is a basic understanding of the ecology of Nothofagus and the other species with which it interacts. The purpose is twofold: to provide a basis on which to consider sustained yield management of such forests and to understand the conditions which allow these forests to maintain themselves. So that was meant to be a job description for a 2-year stint in the Peace Corps. It's been my job description for 40 plus years now. So, again, for a little bit of context, in the 1970s, when I went to Chile, there was really no sort of serious management of the native forests. They were being wastefully exploited, both by small operators and by large companies. In many cases, at the lowest elevations, native forests were being converted to agricultural land use, and then the big issue was that the native forest was being converted to pine and eucalypt plantations. Pines are not native to the southern hemisphere. They've been introduced to the southern hemisphere, and they support a very large-scale industrial plantation economy in numerous southern hemisphere countries. So in the 1970s, there was a major conflict between a few locos, crazy people, that thought that you could manage the native forest on a sustainable basis, versus the prevailing idea in the forestry community that basically argued, well, we can't sustainably manage it, so let's just cut it and use the resource as quickly as possible, plant fast-growing pines, and move on. Fortunately, times have changed in Chile, so there is today a much greater appreciation of all the ecosystem services from the native forests. Just for terminology, Nothofagus is the genus of trees that I'll be referring to. Won't talk in great detail about them. This is the most widespread genus of trees in the southern temperate zone. It consists of broadleaf trees. The leaf habits happen to be both evergreen and deciduous, so don't be confused when I talk about evergreen beech. They are not conifers, okay? So when I started in Chile, first thing I did was to examine all the forest inventory data. Don't laugh. Yeah, that is me. Okay. So it was very evident from the forest inventory data that there was a bit of a puzzle. In the old growth forests, which were the only ones that they did inventories in, the dominant trees were all nothofagus. The largest dominant trees were all nothofagus, and they were all represented by very large trees, typically well over a half a meter in diameter. There was a complete lack of small size trees, a lack then of regeneration within the old growth forests. Just walking around my first few field trips in the forest, likewise, you'd see the same thing. You've got all these 1 meter, 2 meter diameter trees, but where's the regeneration? So that was the puzzle, which we investigated for those first 4 years in Chile. I developed a research protocol working at stand levels and also at landscape scale levels, and energetically tried to apply the protocol to as many different forest types as we could possibly cover in every year. So we basically showed in those 4 years that the regeneration of nothofagus is dependent on coarse scale, relatively infrequent disturbances. So if you want to look find where the trees are regenerating, you've got to walk out of the forest. You have to go to recently disturbed sites. The different kinds of disturbances that were important were especially landslides triggered by earthquakes, landslides triggered by extreme storms, blowdown events, volcanic ash deposition plays an important role, and fire as well. The work that we did in the second half of the 1970s was part of a global movement in scientific ecology away from old traditional equilibrium thinking. Sometimes you might refer to it as climax theory, towards non-equilibrium paradigms that accepted repeated disturbance, did not postulate stasis or some sort of equilibrium condition as necessarily an endpoint of successional change, and in which case you would tend to look for all aged tree populations within the really old forests. We showed that in the really old forests, 400, 500-year-old forests, they were actually old, late successional stands that had originated after coarse scale disturbances such as flood deposits, mass movements, and so on. In addition to working on nothofagus, I also worked on conifers, sometimes referred to as Gondwanan conifers. This is the giant Fitzroy cuprossoides. This is the largest tree in the temperate forests of southern South America. It's also the oldest tree, reaching over 3,000 years in age in the southern hemisphere. The first project that I worked on involved an analysis of post-logging regeneration. You can see that these forests were being clear-cut, had been clear-cut in the 1960s and 1970s. For scale here, this is a logging truck down here. These are quite large trees, 60 meters in height, 3 to 4 meters in diameter, very valuable wood. So the first paper that we published in 1976 was on this species, and basically it documented the lack of regeneration following logging operations. That paper was picked up by someone in the US Fish and Wildlife Service, and as a result, Fitzroya became the first foreign tree species included in our listed threatened species, so the products could not be imported to the US. You can imagine that the timber industry was not happy with that outcome. So there's been a continuous battle really over the protected status of Fitzroya. It is pretty well protected now, but the listing of that species by Fish and Wildlife Service in 1979 was a really important step in terms of getting it included in the Convention on International Trade and Endangered Species. I have to remember not only to breathe, but to drink once in a while too. Some of you recognize a few people here, a couple people. So in 2014, I went to a book launching in Valdivia, Chile. That's at the forestry school where I taught from 75 to 79. The title of the book is Forest Ecology, the Basis for Sustainable Management and Conservation of the Forests, Native Forests of Chile. Argentinian forests are included, but the Chileans tend not to recognize the Argentinian component here. Anyway, so the editors of the book are in that picture. On the right is Antonio Lara, who was an undergraduate in the forestry program at the University of Chile in Santiago when I gave a lecture there in 1979. I guess he liked the lecture because he followed me here to pursue a PhD in our department. He graduated in 1991, went back to Chile. He led the first national vegetation mapping campaign or project in Chile. It's called the Catastro. It's still going on. It's a very important source of information for resource management. He also developed the first tree ring lab in Chile and became the dean of the College of Forest Sciences and has obviously supervised numerous graduate students and honor students. On the left is Mauro Gonzalez, who I met at a conference in 1996 in Chile, and he came here to do his PhD, finishing in 2002, and he worked on the fire history and fire ecology of the Araucaria forests. Araucaria is the iconic, emblematic species for the national park system in Chile. He went back to Chile to the same forestry school where I worked, and he's now the director of the forestry curriculum, and he's also the go-to person for anything related to fire ecology, fire history, and restoration in the Araucaria forests, which is pretty important because there have been huge fires in the Araucaria forests in recent years. The shorter of the two older folks in the center there is Claudio Donoso, who I first met when we were both students at University of California in Berkeley in 1974. Claudio was studying population genetics, wanted to work on tree improvement projects when he returned to Chile. Claudio started his career in forestry at a somewhat later age because first he resigned his commission as a major in the Chilean army to go back to school. And if some of you can think back to 1972, 73, 74, you understand why he resigned from the Chilean army. So Claudio returned to Chile about 1976. Then he was hired by my forestry school 1978 to work with me for a year to basically carry on the kind of research that I had started there in the 1970s. Claudio has been extremely effective in promoting legislation to protect the native forest. He was a key person in finally getting what's called the Native Forest Law passed by Congress. It was originally proposed in 1992 and eventually approved in 2008. It took a while. Sometimes I refer to Claudio as the conscience of the native forest. So the three of them edited this book on forest ecology and management for the native forests of southern Chile, which is basically, it's an operator's manual. There are more than 200 authors. There are numerous chapters. It's extremely comprehensive. And in a rare display of ego, I will translate the dedication. So we dedicate this book to Professor Tom Veblen, pioneer in the study of the ecology and dynamics of the temperate forests of Chile and Argentina. His great contribution during the last 40 years in the understanding of the functioning of these unique ecosystems in the world has promoted their conservation and sustainable management. His prolific scientific work and dedication inspire and will continue inspiring many future students and professionals. Thought that was rather nice of them. So I guess the underlying message is that in addition to research, teaching and mentoring are absolutely essential if we want to have any impact. So, as was mentioned in my introduction, I spent 2 years in Chile on a postdoc with the Forest Research Institute, working on very similar topics, using very similar field data protocols, and so on. Part of the context for that work was to evaluate a long-standing and very influential hypothesis which had been developed by the director of the Protection Forestry Division of the Forest Service, which is why it had so much influence, which involved interpretation of gaps in tree population structures, sort of missing age classes, as being interpretable on the basis of climate variability. We quickly concluded that this was also a misinterpretation resulting from the application of old equilibrium paradigms, expecting all age tree population structures within old stands and underappreciating the roles of repeated disturbances. So essentially, we transferred some of our learning in a conceptual sense from southern Chile to the very similar forests, also dominated by Nothofagus, in New Zealand. The other part of the context for that work was the impact of introduced animals. As I'm sure many people know, New Zealand did not have any native mammals other than bats, and so when deer were introduced massively in the 19th century, they produced all sorts of undesirable consequences in terms of their impacts on forests. So we've had the opportunity to make a number of west to east comparisons across the southern hemisphere temperate zone, which I'm not going to go into in any detail. One of our first synthesis attempt at this was this book over here on the right, The Ecology and Biogeography of Nothofagus Forests, which I edited in 1996. That came out of a conference sponsored by the Southern Connection. In 1991, about 30 of us created an organization to sponsor meetings every third year in different Southern Hemisphere countries so that there could be more interchange and more collaboration. And unfortunately, I was either the vice president or the president for 25 years, but now I'm out of it. So this review paper called Tectonic Ecology came out of our most recent meeting in 2016 in Punta Arenas, Magallanes. And this basically reviews our early work and the follow-up work, both in New Zealand and in southern Chile, on the role of large-scale disturbances. The editor of or editors of the New Zealand Journal of Botany wrote this little note, which again I'm going to read. Parallel studies in New Zealand and Chile on large-scale disturbances, our work, were key in overturning the old paradigm of equilibrium forest dynamics. Such disequilibrium that had been accepted as the consequence of climate change now could be more satisfyingly interpreted in terms of the long-lasting influence of these physical disruptions. This conceptual advance has been critical to the interpretation of the ongoing effect of other pressures on forests in both countries, such as the impact of invasive mammals. Working for the Forest Service at the time that we wrote our first papers, though, did engender a little bit of concern, hostility, etc. So I'm pleased that over the years, the contribution that we made at that time has been broadly accepted. So, After 2 years in New Zealand, I came here in 1981. And although I have loved working on fire history, bark beetles, and so on in Colorado, I was not about to give up my long-standing interest in the Southern Hemisphere. So as a beginning faculty member, the challenge is, well, how are you going to get funding to continue to do that work? I had a number of sort of seed and pilot projects in the early years, some funded by CU, including a faculty fellowship program that we no longer have. I hope we can bring it back sometime. And in 1987, in Argentina, I was invited to participate in a program called SPIDER. SPIDER stands for the Special Program for the Improvement and Development of Ecological Research, obviously in Argentina. It was funded by their equivalent of the National Science Foundation, CONICET, which is the Argentinian Science and Technology Council. The purpose of SPIDER was to recruit early career scientists, that was me, maybe mid-career scientists, who could be mentors and advisors to graduate students interested in ecology in Argentina at that time. There was a need for that because there was a missing cohort. Basically, young people who otherwise would have been the age group to mentor the graduate students had been exiled, voluntarily left the country, or were disappeared during the dictatorship. Following my initial involvement in SPIDER, which included giving workshops, short workshops a week, a couple days, and also providing field opportunities for Argentinian students, I came back and was able to obtain some support from the graduate school and the geography department to help with the recruitment of students from Argentina. And under an agreement then with SPIDER, SPIDER paid for travel costs, which was a huge issue in those days, and the university helped out with tuition costs. Then following that, from 1990 onwards, our work in Argentina has been funded by National Science Foundation and by the Argentine equivalent. So I wanted to point out a couple of the SPIDER-sponsored students. In 1991, this is Ricardo Villalba and Thomas Kietzberger coring an alerce tree from which long-term, at least several centuries, in some cases up to about 1,000 years, proxy records of temperature and precipitation have been developed depending on the particular site that you're working at. These two students were supported by SPIDER. Thomas graduated with his PhD from CU in 1994, went back to the University of Comahue in Bariloche, Argentina, where he has become an internationally recognized researcher in various aspects of plant ecology. In 1999, he was a co-recipient of the Gold Medal Award given by the Bornhe and Brun Foundation, which is the most prestigious environmental award in Argentina. And of course, he's been supervising many students there over the years. Ricardo Villalba graduated in 1995 here. He went back to Mendoza, Argentina, where he also developed an international reputation for his work in paleoclimatology. He became the director of IANIGLA, which is their National Snow and Ice and Environmental Science Institute. And he was the primary person responsible for the passage of legislation by the Argentine Congress that requires monitoring of glaciers in Argentina, which also helps fund his institute. So these are a couple of people who have had major impacts. I continue today to be co-supervising grad students and postdocs with both of them. Okay, so now to the main event, okay? I'm going to just highlight some of our research findings. I didn't think that in this kind of venue it's appropriate to go through a lot of the data acquisition procedures and the analytical procedures, and so I'm going to tell you some stories about what we've learned. The collaborators in this current phase of our work over about the last 7 years on this topic include Estela Rafael, who did a postdoc with me, funded by Argentina in 1995 to 97. Then to the right is Melissa Blackhall, who just finished her PhD in 2013, co-supervised by Estela and myself. Now we're collaborating. Then over on the left, Nacho Mundo, who did his PhD with Ricardo Villalba, his postdoc with Thomas Kietsberger, and now we've been collaborating for about 5 or 6 years. In the center, some of you recognize Andres Holtz, who graduated from our department in 2010. He's originally from Chile. He's now on the faculty at Portland State University. And over on the right is Juan Paritzis, who also graduated from our department in 2010. And despite the Greek name, he is from Argentina. And I already introduced Thomas Kietsberger. So I'm going to quickly describe some of the broad scale climate and fire patterns and consider briefly some of the past human influences on wildfire activity in Patagonia and try and drive home the main message that warming and drying trends are increasing wildfire activity throughout a broad region of the Andean Patagonian area. Then I'll talk a little bit about the fire-promoting ecological feedbacks, where the main message is that the tall forests, mostly dominated by Nothofagus, are resistant to fire. They're not easily burned, but once they're burned the first time, the post-fire vegetation is much more fire-prone. So a shift from pyrophobic tall forests to pyrophytic tall shrublands and bamboo thickets. And then I'll just show a couple slides related to land use impacts. So on the left here, we have a vegetation map of Chile that it also includes our study areas in Argentina, which I will summarize diagrammatically as basically depicting the desert vegetation in northern Chile, the Atacama Desert. As we go from north to south, we go through the Mediterranean type region of Chile, very similar to Central California, where we have sclerophyll, shrublands, and woodlands. And then south of about 37 degrees, we have a whole series of different types of temperate rainforests as we get into areas where seasonally there is less drought during summer, so you have basically year-round precipitation in the far south. Don't be distracted by the codes on the left. Those are reporting districts for fire statistics, but they only go back to about 1984 in Chile. Over on the right here, conceptually, fire activity, as you would expect, is very minimal in the far north because there's no vegetation to burn, lack of resources, lack of biomass to burn. It peaks in central Chile, so you've got plenty of biomass to burn, and climate variability on a very regular basis. Seasonality allows dry conditions for fires to get started easily. And then as we go all the way to the far south, we gradually get a decline in fire activity simply because we don't often have conditions that are dry enough for forest burning. So for context, the climate record in Patagonia shows the same pattern that we observe in most of the world, warming. So for stations that are centered in northern Patagonia at about 43 degrees latitude, and also for the stations centered at about 47 degrees latitude, we've had multi-decadal trends towards warmer temperatures, in this case depicted for the growing season, October through March in the southern hemisphere. So the main drivers of variability in precipitation in this part of the world include the El Niño Southern Oscillation, ENSO, which people have heard about on their weather reports for many, many years now. So that accounts for variability in precipitation at timescales of about 2 to 5 years. Then the other driver depicted here is SAM, which is the Southern Annular Mode. It's also called the Antarctic Oscillation. A few of you have probably heard of that. I know a few of you have, though. it's analogous to the Arctic oscillation in the northern hemisphere. This is the leading driver of extratropical climate variability in the southern hemisphere. It does not have any particular periodicity like ENSO. When it's in a positive phase, it drives the southern hemisphere westerlies, which are flowing across here, circumpolar basically, or circumhemispherical, to higher latitudes. So when SAM is in a positive phase, it shifts the storm tracks to the south, so that the storm tracks are just barely catching the tip of South America, and they're really mostly to the south of South America. Which means then that we have drought in association with positive values of SAM. One of the interesting aspects of SAM is that when you look at the annual depiction, indexing of SAM, SAM is indexed in a couple of different ways, but generally based on the atmospheric pressure differences at about 40 degrees latitude compared to about 60 or 65 degrees latitude. Since the index was first measured in the 1950s, SAM has been on an upward trend, which is really, really interesting because climatically, that tells us that northern Patagonia should be drying because storm tracks have been shifting to the south. And in fact, that's what Chilean climatologist René Garraud has shown in numerous papers. So the dark blue color here, which is centered on our main study area in northern Patagonia, is actually the center for the steepest decline in precipitation over the time period from 1968. So we have broad-scale warming. We have variability in precipitation. We also have a trend, but it's year-to-year variability, which usually gets most of our attention. As a result, we get what's called a global change type drought. In this case, following the drought of the late 1990s, there was massive tree death in all the nothofagus forests in northern Patagonia. In addition to massive tree mortality, as you would expect, we also get upsurges in wildfire activity. So this map, or these photos, depict the successively greater amounts of annual area burn, so successive burn records for the various national parks that we've been working in. So 1996 and 1999 in Nahuapi, and adjacent national parks in Argentina, that was a record fire year. In the Araucaria parks or zone in Chile and adjacent part of Argentina, 2002, it was a record fire year, then again another record in 2015, and in the province of Chubut, the southern part of our study area, in 2015, again, was another record fire year. Very interestingly, we also have a trend in lightning-ignited fires. I should have pointed out earlier that there's been controversy about the role of humans in igniting fire historically. Some of the paleo people thought about that for about 30 years, I think, where one paleoecologist said basically in a charcoal record, anytime you find fire, it's evidence of people. That's false, but it was very difficult to disabuse that person of that belief. In our study areas, on the Argentine side, we have good park records starting from 1938, continuing to the present. We have a fair amount of confidence in those records. We've worked with many of the people who actually produced the incident reports. So those park records show that humans account for the majority of fires, depending on the park, anywhere from about 60 to 80% of the fire events are set by humans, accidentally or sometimes arson. But the total area burned in all those parks is greater in the case of fires that are associated with lightning. Generally 50 or 60% of the area burned is accounted for by lightning-ignited fires. Now, the park records, well, first the climate record, can't see this too well, shows that from 1940 to the early 2000s, average summer temperatures show a pretty remarkable shift in the mid-1970s. In association with that shift towards warmer summers, the mid-1970s, there's a major shift here from low numbers of lightning-ignited fires to high numbers of lightning-ignited fires. So in addition to warming and drying trends, there is also evidence of an increase in the frequency of lightning-ignited fires. And the climatologists in the group will certainly be aware of that shift in the mid-1970s, which was a shift in PDO, but I won't get into the details on that.
Gosh, you can barely see that.
Yeah.
But on the temperature gauge, it's kind of...
Sure. So the temperature is oscillating down here around 13 degrees, and then in the mid-1970s jumps up and looks very similar to this right here. So there's a big shift towards warmer temperatures after the mid-1970s. So I think I pointed out the documentary fire history records from Chile are only reliable from about 1984 onwards. They're good records in the sense that they cover the entire country. The Argentine fire records are reliable from the 1938-39 period onwards, but they only cover the national parks. So we don't have good complete geographical coverage from those records. But we do have the option of using tree ring fire scar data that we develop ourselves to extend that kind of understanding of fire history. These are the 4 conifer species that we've used in our fire history studies, both in northern Patagonia and also on the western side of the Andes in Chile and southern Patagonia. Then just recently, this manuscript was submitted a couple weeks ago, we extended the construction of our fire scar network from relying just on conifer species because they disappear towards the southern end of the continent. So we've also produced records from Nothofagus pumilio, from sites which I hope you can see in this map are close to the Patagonian ice fields, as far south as about 53 degrees latitude. So currently in the fire scar network that we started developing in the late 1980s, no one had published a paper on fire scar history in South America prior to our first paper in 1992. And now we're up to about 2,200 fire scarred trees and over 100 sites, including sites as far north now as northern Argentina, which I won't talk about. So I'm going to just briefly highlight some of the findings from the work that we did in northern Patagonia and then try and compare that a bit to findings over a much broader area. So the red dots in this map are sample sites that represent a gradient from really wet forests with Fitzroya all the way out towards the steppe under a very steep precipitation gradient in the rain shadow of the Andes there. And the picture in the center there is of Ostracedrus, which has nice clear rings. It's by far the easiest species to work with. It's a bit similar to working with ponderosa pine here. And also included in the project was one of our grad students from CU, Joe Donegan, who's a bit perplexed about how is he going to core a hollow tree. So the little vertical lines here refer to years of widespread fire within a study area. These are examples of sites that are dominated by Fitzroya, the really wet rainforest locations, deep in the Andes. Most of these are pretty remote areas. And you can see that long before there was any European settlement, which didn't start until the 1880s to 1890s, we do have evidence of fire. One of the take-home messages from that is simply that even the wet rainforests under really warm, dry conditions are susceptible to burning, and that may be the case in the future. Moving eastward to somewhat drier forests, but they're still mesic forests, the fire activity tends to occur in pulses, historically, associated with European colonization in the 1880s, 90s, early 1900s, where they were trying to transform forest to ranching and other agricultural purposes. So these are just numbers of fires and actually numbers of stand initiating dates where there was a coincidence of the severe 1908 drought with the period, longer time period, of attempted forest clearance by the European colonists. And this is a pattern that we find in numerous of our study sites, but the dates, of course, differ depending on the timing of settlement. As we move further east, out to the Patagonian steppe and ecotone with open woodlands, we have these woodlands that are dominated by Austrosagis, somewhat reminiscent of ponderosa pine at low elevations here. And again, the vertical lines are years of widespread fire within a study area. So each study area contains 20 to 50 fire-scarred trees. And there is a pattern of increased density of those lines, meaning increased fire, in the middle part of the 19th century. That is associated with the migration of Native Americans from Chile, from southern Chile, which was being colonized by Europeans at that time, so they were expelled and moved into Patagonia on the eastern side of the Andes. And as a result, and we're also using fire, which I'll illustrate for you in just a second. And then you can see towards the ends of those horizontal lines, a decrease in fire occurrence, which reflects, for the most part, cessation of intentional burning by the Native American population, as opposed to active fire suppression, which requires some infrastructure, which was generally not available in most of these areas. So this is just a depiction, a sketch made by an explorer in the 1700s who traveled through this area and described the use of fire by the Native Americans for hunting the guanaco, an American camelid, and the ostrich-like bird, the rhea or nyandu. Now, following the cessation of burning at the turn of the previous century, there's been woody encroachment, going from left to right. I might have gotten the numbers wrong here, sorry. Or is this top to bottom? Yeah, left to right, but I have the dates wrong. So 1896, then this is 1985 over here. You can see a considerable densification of the woody vegetation as a result of the elimination of formerly frequent surface fires that kept trees out of that kind of environment, analogous to what we've seen right on the outskirts at low elevations in Boulder here. So we've conducted and published a lot of studies for these different regions, which I'm not going to go through in any detail, but I'll try and summarize some of the key findings. So generally, the Aboriginal populations increased fire incidents through intentional burning, mostly for the purpose of hunting. There's a strong spatial correlation between archaeological evidence of occupation and fire frequency. European settlers increased fire incidents in the 19th to early 20th century, but in a pulse-like fashion. Those pulses also resulted in major changes, long-lasting changes in the landscape with important legacies today. And the effectiveness of fire suppression varies tremendously geographically among all these regions. For the most part, the fire exclusion, the reduction in the frequency of fire during the last few decades reflects a decrease in intentional burning rather than really effective fire suppression. So those are some interpretations about the effects of humans on the frequency of fire. The climate analyses that we've done focus on fire extent. So it's based on determining years of widespread fire where there is synchronous fire occurrence. For example, 25% of all of our sample sites over an extensive region in the same year synchronously record fire. Then we analyze those fire dates, time series, in relation to tree ring reconstructions of temperature and precipitation. I've given you the example of a reconstruction of the southern annular mode derived from tree rings, Tasmania and New Zealand and southern South America, which was created by Ricardo Villalba a number of years ago, and constantly has been revised. The long-term fire records indicate that the extent of fire is very much driven by ENSO as far south as about 44 degrees latitude, so somewhere about here. The southern annular mode influences fire history strongly throughout the entire area. So the southern annular mode is really the big player in terms of controlling fire extent, which is somewhat concerning given the fact that there has been this upward trend in SAM since the 1950s, and climate models predict that that upward trend will continue in the future. A couple of quick comments about fire-promoting ecological feedbacks. The take-home message is that in this kind of landscape, fire begets fire. So we started working on this question based on just observing really sharp boundaries between the tall shrublands and the subalpine forests of Nothofagus pumilio, one of the deciduous beeches, which that forest type occurs from about 36 degrees latitude all the way to the southern end of South America. This is a common pattern. So you can see another example here where tall shrublands, which burn frequently, meet up against the subalpine forest. In most years, fires will stop right at that limit. So that leads to the hypothesis then that there must be some positive feedbacks and some negative feedbacks that would account for that sort of pattern. One of the positive feedbacks is that the vegetation in the shrublands includes an abundance of these tall bamboos, Chusquea species bamboos. That's a full-size Chilean there for scale. Sorry if there are any Chileans in the group, sorry. Anyway, the bamboos can be 6 or 7 meters in height. Very tediously in the 1970s, I produced the first biomass measurement of bamboo anywhere in the world. 160 tons per hectare, which is in the lower range of biomass for our subalpine forests here in Colorado. The difference is this is all fine fuel. 160 tons of fine fuel. Fine fuel is what easily burns. So these shrublands that are co-dominated by woody shrubs and also by the bamboos are highly flammable. Once a fire gets started in one of those, they tend not to stop until they get to another vegetation type. So one of my collaborators, Monica Mermos, who's a senior scientist with the National Park Service in Argentina, and we started working together in 1985, and then eventually she decided she wanted to do a master's, and so Thomas Keatsberg and I co-supervised her master's in about 2004 or 5. Her work is based on mapping the pre-burn vegetation over a very large area and showing that there is a much greater propensity for the tall shrublands and bamboo thickets to burn compared to the tall forests. So that is the case in a normal sort of fire year. That's the typical pattern when it's dry enough to burn, but it's not an extreme drought. During the time period of her analysis from 1950 to 1999, there were 8 extreme fire years, 8 extreme droughts. During those extreme droughts, that's when the fires blow right up from the tall shrublands into the subalpine forest, so wipes out that old pattern. You can see right at the edge of the forest, the previous fire had created an even-aged post-fire stand in 1908, but then in the 1999 fire, the fire just blew all the way through the old growth forest, all the way up to tree line. So these are the sort of pulses of events which are shaping the landscape in northern Patagonia. We've done similar work now, led by Juan Paritzis, up to the high latitudes of southern Patagonia with very, well, identical results pretty much. In addition to the mapping work that he's done that documents the greater propensity of the tall shrublands to burn relative to the fire-resistant forests, we've also done a number of studies based on identifying the stand level and plant level mechanisms that would explain the differences in flammability. So this involves measuring fuels at a community or stand level, looking at the percentage of fine fuels. The higher percentage of fine fuels, the more flammable the vegetation is, and looking at the spatial distribution within the stand. Do you have gaps in fuels from the surface way up to the tree canopy, or do you have continuous fuels from the surface? And all of that evidence is supportive of the interpretation that the tall shrublands are much more flammable than the tall forests. We've also done work led by Melissa Blackhall on individual plant traits of flammability, which also supports that interpretation. So to sort of summarize that, in the tall forests, the dominants are all obligate seed producers. They do not resprout after being burned. They have to produce seed to resprout. That means they're typically, and there are no serotinous, meaning closed cone or closed fruit species like lodgepole pine, so they're slow to recover after a fire. In contrast, the shrubland species, every single one, vigorously resprouts after being burned. There are spatial gaps in the vertical fine fuel distributions in the forest. Sometimes you have a completely clear understory or just dwarf understory, and then 10 or 15 or 20 meters before you get to any other fine fuel at high elevation. And that's an obvious contrast from the shrublands. We've obviously compared microclimates, hot and dry in the shrublands versus cool, comfortable, high relative humidity in the forests. So just a few comments about land use impacts. We've done experimental work based on putting in animal exclosures, in some cases including little experiments where we have altered temperatures and altered precipitation, moisture availability as well. But here you see examples of areas that we've fenced off against livestock and areas that we've tried, small areas that we try to protect from the European hare, another introduced species which does a lot of damage to tree regeneration. Bottom line is that following fire, if you want to have tree regeneration, you really have to protect the sites from these introduced animals. Not only livestock, but the introduced deer as well. Another important land use impact is the planting of pines, so that fairly heterogeneous mosaics of landscape like this that have some natural fire breaks in them, beginning with the planting of pine plantations in northern Patagonia in 1980, are being transformed to homogeneous, more flammable fuels. Pines are more flammable than any of the native species there, native tree species anyway, so that now the pine plantations can support high severity fires over extensive areas. It's rather ironic that some of those plantations were done for carbon sequestration. Think about that a second. It's also ironic that many of the forests that were burned in the 1950s, the native forests, were reforested by introduced pines. And so it's a landscape change from a forest which is difficult to burn to a landscape that sure may be producing some timber, but it is much more flammable. Monterey pine, lodgepole pine, and ponderosa pine are the main species that have been introduced and planted in Patagonia. Monterey pine in Patagonia is serotinous, meaning that cones open after being burned and they seed prolifically. So that following the burning of a plantation, you get abundant regeneration of the pine. So there's another feedback there too. The plantations increase fire, and they increase the ability of the pines to regenerate and to become invasive species. Lodgepole pine is the most difficult species to deal with in terms of being an invasive species. Those are lodgepoles that are invading the Patagonian steppe, a significant difference or distance from seed trees. Another unfortunate land use practice has been what they call enrichment planting in the native forest, where they've planted pines in the Araucaria forest, which obviously completely changes the continuity of fuels and increases the probability of fire, and especially high severity fire. Then the other land use change which is going on is rapid exurban development. Many of you have probably been tourists in Patagonia and know that there's a huge tourist boom that's been going on for 15 or 20 years. So basically, we just have more people on the landscape, and as a result, we have more sources of ignition for fire. So to wrap up, the situation that I've described for northern Patagonia in particular, but also applies to most of Patagonia, is what we sometimes call committed ecosystem change. We haven't observed, and we project to see a continued increase in wildfire activity driven mainly by climate. There are positive feedbacks from the initial burning of the tall forests so that fire begets fire. It's making it even worse of a problem. Trying to avoid doom and gloom here, but it might be hard, sorry. Land use changes are a big problem too, contributing to the problems. There are many mitigation and adaptation challenges, though, that are a source of some optimism in terms of slowing down, at least, or postponing some of the inevitable changes. Managed wildfire, something that most of us working in the US think is just great. It tends to buffer the system from fires. That's not an option in most of Patagonia. Managed wildfire would just worsen the problem. Protection of post-fire sites from livestock and other herbivores is something that technically is very feasible. It's expensive, but it is definitely being done, and some of it's being done directly in response to our work. They have restricted pine planting, so that, and they've totally restricted the planting of lodgepole pine in Patagonia because it is such a problem as an invasive species. And then the big problem, of course, is how do you restrict residential expansion into fire-prone environments? That's a major social, political problem, which is very difficult to deal with in Patagonia, and it's very difficult to deal with here. We're not doing much better than they are there. Oops. Thanks very much.
Okay, we'll entertain a few questions.
Richard.
I was particularly interested in your discussion about disturbance causing a shift in vegetation. Does that happen in North America as well, and to what extent? And from your very last slide, prior to this one, do most of those points and does your research, I'm assuming it's mostly applicable to North America as well, as much as it is. Is that true?
Well, in a broad sense, warming, yes. That is the challenge of our time, global warming. And the obvious solution is keep fossil fuels in the ground. Many people are working on that more actively than I am. But when you're trying to get out of a hole, you have to stop digging. So that's like number one. So we certainly share that. That's common in the southern temperate zone as well as the northern temperate zone. In terms of the conceptual frameworks used for understanding vegetation dynamics, yes, the history of thinking has been very similar in North America. It was in the 1970s that there were a lot of quantitative analyses of changes in forest structure and then the development of attempts to quantify disturbance regimes of fire, now bark beetles, tree falls, et cetera, et cetera. So conceptually, that's gone on in both hemispheres and at about the same time. Does that sort of answer your questions? We can talk more at the reception.
Go ahead.
Sure.
After the tall forest species are wiped out by a fire, how and under what circumstances do they naturally regenerate?
Yeah. So, and that's one of the consequences of our work. It's to advise people on, is it worth it to invest the time and money in trying to reforest after a fire? And the basic recommendation is don't bother trying to do it at the eastern, the driest edge of the area that has been burned. Don't try and do it on your equator-ward facing slopes, okay, like a south-facing slope in the northern hemisphere. So we can tell people where it is too dry to expect any natural regeneration, and I briefly alluded to the fact that we've done long-term experimental work where we artificially increased temperatures in little greenhouses, and then we irrigated, added precipitation, added water to simulate precipitation, which showed that under a 1 to 2 degree increase in temperature, even at the higher elevations, even at the somewhat wetter sites, there was basically no regeneration. All that work is still basically on the eastern side of the distribution. So it's not as if in the next 5 years forests are going to disappear all the way from Patagonia to the coast of the Pacific. But there is a very large area that once it's burned, you're not going to get adequate tree regeneration. And you certainly won't get it if you don't protect the sites from livestock and European hare. And vegetation we work with the vegetation managers. They all work for the National Park Service there. And we're constantly discussing these things and giving advice on where it might be worth trying to do some planting, where you might hope to get some natural regeneration, where to invest in the fences to keep the livestock out, and so on.